Oh, Stalin's a man, he so belongs to be all the revolution, or the planet, and the conscience till the day died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fruit of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
Welcome back. It is us again as the Empire continues its inexorable slide down the corkscrew of fate into the salty marshes of eternal pessimism. We will be here chronicling every step of this particularly treacherous twisting and turning story. And joining me, as always, is our representative from the Washington future socialist Yugoslavia. It's Kit Clarenberg, everybody.
Yes, and to quote the genius of Chris Morris on the hour, as the events napkin unswivels, we Alex and I are here on the front line to bring you the latest and greatest or worst breaking news about the state of the Anglo-American global hegemony, which is going to pieces faster than a leper in a wind tunnel in many ways. So yeah, it's always a pleasure, never a burden. Thanks for joining us, people.
And just in case you haven't seen it yet, we've only just launched this, the Decline and Fall show is now available on Spotify, meaning you can get this on your local podcast app. So we will be advertising that quite shortly. We will also be present on Twitter on an official basis very soon. So keep an eye out for that as well. But to give you an advance preview, good listeners and viewers, what links Keir Starmer and Confessions of a Window Cleaner? You'll be finding out later in this episode as we go into Confessions of a Failing British Prime Minister. Oh. Yes, I don't have a slide whistle to imply the falling of the trousers, but we've got everything else. He is.
I do think a good overall name for this episode might be Starmageddon.
Yes,
but there's a lot more to it than that. So let's leap in. What have we got?
Now let's dive into the madness and chaos that is the decline and fall of the empire. So here we go. Right, let's just get that here. Yeah. So first thing on the cards today is, of course, the utter failure of British and NATO forces, as discussed many times before on this program. It is now coming out through an article on responsible statecraft from a former Royal Navy Commodore by the name of Steve Jermy that, and I'll quote the headline here, right now, NATO could not win a war with Russia. And this is the article on responsible statecraft. And in this, Jeremy essentially goes into all the things that you have mentioned in your reporting before, Kit, and we've talked about on the show, which is essentially the British Army can't do it. Most of NATO is now outproduced in terms of military industrial capacity, and is outnumbered on the ground by Russian armed forces. Even the stronger bits of NATO, mainly its air force, wouldn't last against Russia's air defenses. So essentially, you've got a very high-ranking former officer in the Royal Navy essentially admitting that everything that those of us on the anti-imperialist side have been saying for over a year now, maybe longer, has been correct. So what did you make of this rather startling confession? And does it show, to your mind, that there are people in even the British establishment who are now thinking this enterprise is doomed?
Yeah, well, I mean, I found this article particularly striking because and I use the royal you here, not you, Alex, because you know what you're talking about. But like, I mean, you would be shocked at like the sheer amount of hawkish former high-ranking British and sometimes American military officials who are insanely hawkish, have complete delusions about the power of NATO and the US and Britain militarily, and also Russia's alleged quote unquote weakness, which we'll get into. For someone with this, with Steve Germany's experience and what's the word? Curriculum vitae, to be openly stating what people like you and I have been saying for many, many years is really quite amazing. And I think as well that the interestingly, he doesn't talk about it too much, but he states that NATO's bombing of Kosovo was quote unquote satisfactory in terms of the military alliance's military record. Actually, it was a total disaster and was admitted as such at the time. It was very good at destroying civilian infrastructure and killing innocent people, including many children. It left the Yugoslav military unscathed, because you cannot fight a war via air power, as we have seen with the US Air Force's defeat by Ansar Allah in Yemen, and the Gaza genocide, where the Israeli occupation Air Force was very good at slaughtering civilians on a massive scale. It wasn't at all effective at grazing Hamas. But overall, I think that this is the latest in the long line of kind of admissions by people who know what they're talking about in the mainstream, who typically get zero media platform at all, that NATO is in a very bad position indeed. And also, despite all of the proclamations of how, well, if Russia defeats Ukraine, which it inevitably will, then it's going to start turning its sights on Europe and other countries as well. Then why is no major NATO country, or in fact no NATO country at all, actually trying to mobilize for war? Now, the answer to that is manifold. On the one hand, it's because they actually know it's a total lie that Russia is going to start pushing into Poland and further afield. But also, as we have discussed ad infinitum before, no major NATO nation has the defense industrial base to do this. So, and I think that I am sure that this, in the manner of Responsible Statecraft, is an excellent organization which routinely publishes excellent articles, which usually get ignored. But there are signs that there are think tanks, quote unquote, and other defense industry funded entities within the imperial core who are waking up to this fact. I think we discussed months ago that there was a report by Rusi which stated that wars of attrition, which are dependent on the ability to produce pretty much endless artillery shells, missiles, etc. NATO is not in a position to do this at all. And if they wanted to prepare for this, they needed to start doing it about 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, look, it's been 3 years since the beginning of the special military operation, almost exactly 3 years.
Yes.
And Britain, the most saber-rattling country in the NATO military alliance, more so even than the Americans themselves, as we've discussed before, or the Germans or the French even. What have the British governments done since 2022? So you've had Johnson, briefly Truss, Sunak, and now Starmer, perhaps Wes Streeting next. And what has been done with regards to the actual military industrial capacity of Britain? There's been a lot of talk. There's been a lot of big announcements. There's about a strategy for constructing naval vessels, a strategy for re-equipping the army, a strategy for this, that, or the other. What's actually been done is exceedingly little, next to nothing, in actual fact, proving that, as you say, they never seriously believe for a moment that Russia's ambitions stretched beyond Ukraine itself. And that was initially a very limited operation. But it also proves and we'll come to Ukraine later, like what we've discussed before, which is it proves the absolute naked cynicism of mainly the British and the Americans, with the British in the lead on this one, who essentially, with their love of outsourcing and, of course, their love of actually outsourcing just about everything, have outsourced British military capacity to this Ukrainian army, which they now see as like a sort of modern day version of the East India Company army, which they can deploy at their pleasure, at minimal political risk to themselves. The only political risk is, of course, it's twofold. Mainly if this thing goes south and there's a big economic kick on, which we'll come to later, and also certain problems over Ukrainian migration to certain areas of Britain. But in terms of political cost, that's quite low. So this like cynical maneuver has essentially led to potentially 1 million, maybe more, Ukrainians dying. And it's the British ruling class who are absolutely at the center of this, whilst they continue to sit on their ever declining industrial base, screaming and waving their rusty swords around that the Russians are coming. Nobody believes them. And eventually this illusion's going to fall to pieces, isn't it? You're muted, mate.
My apologies. Yeah, sorry. I think that like another precisely. I agree wholeheartedly, and I think that what's also interesting as well is I think that what one thing that really jumped out to me was how decayed NATO has become in a unipolar world where it thinks it can act unilaterally whenever it wants for whatever reason. Steve, in this Responsible Statecraft article, writes, shortly after arriving in Afghanistan in 2007, I was shocked to find NATO had no campaign strategy. Well, I mean, again, this was like very, very obvious, but it's like people within the inner imperial core, there is this assumption that we've got people working on this. There must be someone who is investigating the feasibility, but also as well. I mean, as the Grey Zone has revealed, and we have a lot more to come on this, is that the British and American proxy war strategy in Ukraine is often being driven by people like the author of this article. They are frequently military people who have never experienced actual war of the kind that is playing out on the Ukraine's eastern steppe daily. And we had a recent Sun report about a British teenager who hyped up on pro-war propaganda, went to Ukraine to fight when he was just 17, and lasted literal minutes on the front line before he was killed. But also, yeah, they are relying on people who are military historians, who are people who have a military background from decades ago when the world was very, very, very different, for advice on how to prosecute the proxy war now. It is therefore no surprise that so many of Ukraine's grand plans and offensives and counteroffensives have proven to be a total disaster, because it's in the same manner as investment firms are very keen to state past performance is no guide to future performance. It's like, well, okay, well, you're an expert on the Napoleonic Wars. What relevance does that have to the proxy war in Ukraine? The answer is naught. But these are the people who they are consulting, because they are designated experts. And it is precisely because naysayers and cynics and skeptics don't get any airtime that these people are being touted as experts and relied upon, with devastating results for Ukraine.
Well, yes, and also I would say not just historians, but bad historians. It's not just a question of, not just a question that I don't agree with their particular interpretation of history. Like you can read a reactionary history and it not be completely and wildly inaccurate. Like there are reactionaries who've written about World War I and World War II where there's valuable historical detail in there. I will give an example in relation to World War I and the Russian Revolution. Orlando Figes, who later got done for writing his own reviews on Amazon, but his book, A People's Tragedy, which is a reactionary book, anti-Bolshevik, but contains a lot of valuable historical detail about the how the Tsarist state collapsed. So that's an example of a reactionary historian whose work actually has some value to it. What you're getting in like the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Commonwealth Office, probably have been for some time, are hacks who will want to write basically like the British fairy tale version of history, which is a sort of a lullaby for the dozing British ruling class about how British spunk and grit overcame Adolf in 5 SOE operations in France in 1944, and how D-Day was a roaring success because Churchill stuck his chin out and says, "Come on, Ike, get on with it. Let's land on those damn beaches, and I'll lead the forces myself." It's that kind of like comic book history that is popular in British establishment circles. And it's not just that it's bad history. It's also, it's like, it's so far removed from the reality of certainly the Second World War that it leads people to support really dangerous and very stupid things, like we'll come to in a moment, the Krynky operation and the Kursk incursion and various other disasters that the British officer corps have unleashed in Ukraine. Partly because they think of history in these utterly cartoonish terms, completely divorced from what made Britain a powerful imperialist state in the first place, and of course the reality of World War II, which is that the war that war was won by 1943, precisely in the area of the world where this proxy war is being prosecuted now, Russia and the western part of the Soviet Union. And these bozos don't understand that and never will. But I wanted just to draw, before we move on, viewers and listeners' attention to another article. This is from Substack. This is entitled "The Russian Military is Now Stronger Than the US and NATO." And it's from a blog called Institutional Warfare. I've had a read through it. Seems like it's pretty well researched stuff. And the point on that I wanted to emphasize was that not just in terms of fighting capacity, but as Kit was mentioning, sheer industrial capacity with regards to the Russians outstrips the NATO countries by many, many times over. meaning that even if they put everything into starting to produce war material from literally today, if they seize control of all the production facilities in a country, it would still take them 5 years, 10 years to get anywhere near Russian capacity. So this idea that they were then marching into Ukraine is a total non-starter. The point of the Ukraine war was to do all of this, to collapse Russia without risking a single acknowledged Western casualty. But did you want to add anything to that, Kit?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that this is the point, is that so, I mean, as I mentioned about NATO's reliance on air power, like so much of the empires and indeed NATO's power has been completely imaginary, and it's often been based on consciously dishonest and fudged not only readings of history but also like war games exercises. There was a rather forgotten now but infamous war game exercise in 2002 called the Millennium Challenge, which was set up by the Pentagon at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars to prove that reliance on aircraft carriers was sensible, rational, objective. And the way that they did this was they rigged a war game where they constantly changed the rules so the US could win. The opposing team, which was led by this kind of dissident Marine veteran called Paul Van Riper, he routinely employed unorthodox tactics to beat the US, and so then they just changed the rules so he couldn't do this. And it's like and then that myth of air carrier dominance further encouraged the Britain in its desperate quest for relevance and imagined supremacy in the 21st century to sink billions into aircraft carriers which are completely worthless and are now facing scrap or sale to other countries, and routinely travel the seas without any jets on them, therefore defeating their entire purpose. And it's like, yeah, that like they for a very long time, Britain and American military chiefs and thinkers, if you can even call them that, they have had a very specific view of what wars are like, which is based on Afghanistan, which, as Steve in that responsible statecraft article states, was a total disaster, and which we were consistently lied to about until the very day the US pulled out, and then within hours, the entire government and all of its infrastructure that they spent many tens of billions creating dissolved like sugar in hot tea in a few hours. And it's like, that's what they think war is like. We have had numerous, at the very start of the proxy war in Ukraine, there were numerous examples of foreign mercs who went to fight because they thought that they were going to be given top state-of-the-art automatic rifles, and then just get to kill a lot of Russians. And they didn't realize that fighting an actual army with air cover and artillery support is very different to killing basically unarmed Afghan farmers.
Bit of a surprise.
And then they just yeah, shocking. And then they just ran away. Like, they literally just ran away. And it's like that I think that there was, and I've reported on this for my Substack, there was and I think that we've discussed it before, there was a report by RAND, which is this Pentagon-funded think tank, from July 2024, which it escaped my attention at the time, but it effectively stated that, well, we haven't actually been thinking for decades about our ability to procure and manufacture weaponry, because we've relied on contractors, and we have now created a situation where we are running perilously low on our vast stockpiles with no easy, quick means of replenishing the sort of smallest percentage of what we've sent. And this just didn't occur to them at all until an actual war situation. And it's like, again, we have mentioned this before, but it does bear repeating, that the Pentagon at the end of 2022 announced that it was going to start making 100,000 artillery shells a month. This was then revised down very quietly to half that within a few months. And then within a few months later, it was revised down to just 20,000. And there is no indication that they have actually been able to meet this quota. And meanwhile, Russia can make 1.5 artillery shells per month. You know, it's the kind of thing that you would think people might consider. They might sit back.
So just to clarify, that's 1.5 million shells per month, basically, is that
Yes.
Russia can
Yes.
make? Yeah.
Yes.
So whereas like the US is struggling to reach 20,000 a year. So that gives you an indication as to just how bad the military industrial situation really is. And also, again, like to keep hammering this point home, this war was not meant to last this long. This was meant to be over within a few months, thanks to Russian economic and political collapse, with the perception of defeat in Ukraine, not the reality, which is why the British are still obsessed with blowing up bridges or doing spectacular reenactments of D-Day. So this, I think, leads us rather neatly into your latest investigation on your Substack, Kit, on Krynky, very British military cataclysm. So this reveals, drawing on even from sources from Ukraine itself, that the British military officers planned and tried to execute this ludicrous maneuver in a place called Krynky, which we've talked about before, but led to many, potentially thousands of Ukrainian casualties, based essentially on a wing and a prayer and the vain hope that the Russians would give up and run away. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this, Kit, and then I do want to cut at one stage to a gift from Boris Johnson in 2016, but you go ahead first and talk about this latest article from yourself.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that, I mean, if you scroll down a few paragraphs, there is a map of what they were trying to do. Yeah, there we are, which was helpfully provided by the BBC. Now, Krynky was initially, it was launched, I believe, it was kind of September, October 2023. And at the time, Ukrainian officials spoke in parenthetical kind of suggestive terms that this was the start of something a lot bigger. This followed the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in June 2023, which flooded a lot of Kherson. Responsibility for the destruction of that dam is much contested today. I strongly suspect it was the Ukrainians or the British. I don't have evidence for that, but anyway. And so if you look at this map, what they were trying to do was to get from the part of Kherson being a region of a contested region, historically Russian, that became Ukrainian following World War II, where it's separated by a portion of the Dnipro River, and half of it is in Ukrainian hands, half of it is in Russian hands, as it were. Now, they were trying to create a beachhead in this town called Krynky. It's a small village facing the river. The source is particularly interesting on this, and this is what really caught my eye, is that Ukrainska Pravda is this very pro-Zelensky, very pro-government media outlet that was basically created by US aid. And I might add that Mustafa Nayyem, who was the individual who started the Maidan protests in late 2013, he worked there. Right. So, I mean, it couldn't be a more kind of, anti-Russian, pro-Western source. It contained a number of this investigation contained a number of kind of rather stunning and shocking revelations, including the fact that this Krynky, this 9-month-long effort to capture a beachhead in Russian-controlled Kherson, was British devised. Britain provided the equipment. They trained Ukrainian Marines for the effort. They were engaged in aggressive advocacy efforts to get the Ukrainian government on board, because initially they were rather reticent to do this.
Mm.
And then it led for 9 months to wave after wave of Ukrainians being fed into Krynky. Many died on the way. Many were killed or severely injured the second they landed there because the Russians knew they were coming. And they were targeting their boats and targeting their landing spots, and they just kept going. And I think even Putin, in a speech or a kind of public appearance, stated that he expressed kind of bewilderment to Ukraine, to Russian military chiefs. Why do the Ukrainians keep doing this? Like, why do they keep sending wave after wave of Marines into what is essentially a firebag? It's a suicide mission. And we learn from Ukrainska Pravda that Britain, who devised and planned this, excuse me, they wanted to create the Normandy landings. They wanted to recreate D-Day. They thought that if they got enough Ukrainian Marines into Krynky, they could create a beachhead which would serve as the start of a wider invasion of the Russian portion of Kherson, and the Ukrainians would march onwards towards Crimea and outright victory. And this is, I might add, while American officials were saying, if to warning the Ukrainians, any attempt to retake Crimea is going to be met with absolutely unrepentant force by the Russians, because this is a huge red line for them. Anyway, but the point is that yes, it's a kind of modern day Gallipoli in which these poorly equipped, poorly prepared Marines, some of whom couldn't even swim, I might add, were being sent to Krynky on certain death missions. There was zero planning for what might happen if the Russians knew they were coming or didn't run away, as was expected. So then you have it became all but impossible to supply Ukrainians who actually made it there with basic supplies, because the boats sending them weapons and medicine and water would get targeted. So then they had to rely on drones to drop, blood supplies and all sorts of things. And it was just a total and complete disaster. And it was, as you say, inspired by this fantastical Hollywood vision of the significance of D-Day. Of course, any reading of D-Day that doesn't include or doesn't consider the fact that Nazi Germany's air force and pretty much all of their tanks had been decimated during the Red Army Operation Bagration in the months leading up to this, is false history. But that was of no importance. It's also clear that the Ukrainians who carried out this almost uniform suicide mission were lied to. They were told they would have artillery support and HIMARS, would fire like machine guns. This didn't happen. A lot of people involved in this didn't really understand what the point of was. They didn't really get what their objective was, but they just kept on doing it because they were acting under orders. And it was just there was some astonishing stories of, there was this one Ukrainian Marine who was severely injured, got a severe arm injury, and then swam across the Dnipro to reach an island so he could be evacuated, spent 6 hours walking backwards and forwards on this small marshy island so he didn't get frostbite, and then his arm gets amputated. Some Ukrainian Marines were felt compelled to commit suicide because they couldn't be evacuated. And this is all a British operation. And I think that just more generally as well, the fact that this is a point that I've made and has since the start of the proxy war, which has elicited quite a significant amount of skepticism, is that it is the British who are pushing the Ukrainians to do things like blow up Kerch Bridge, and engage in highly escalatory and, if not outright, just completely insane operations, the US is a lot more reserved because I mean, for all of their delusions and incompetence, there are components of the US imperial brain trust who understand that they would not survive all-out war with Russia, and indeed, all-out war with Russia would necessitate nuclear conflict, which they don't want.
Yes.
So, whereas like the British, hyped up on high on the smell of their own farts, they're the ones who are really pushing this, not only because they think that it will be successful, but because they think it will draw the US deeper into it. It's like they're creating a quagmire that the US has to rescue Ukraine from. But no, Washington has rigidly refused to do this. So, I mean, I would urge people, and of course I would say this, to read my investigation in full. But I mean, it is a fascinating and very forensic dissection of what a total failure this was. And I might add that very interestingly, Zelensky, who was the former Ukrainian armed forces chief, who was much hyped as this military genius while in post by the Western media, in May 2024, which is right around the time that Krynky ends, he becomes Ukraine's ambassador to the UK. The commander who oversaw the effort, he's been dismissed due to health reasons, and then now we're looking at Zelensky, as we'll get into, facing a re-election campaign which the US and Russia support, and he's likely going to lose. He's probably going to run away to London as well.
More than likely.
Yes.
So we've talked about this before, but just to re-emphasize the point, it is likely that this disaster in Krynky not only was designed by the British, but also the British were operating off a completely ludicrous version of reality that was utterly divorced from the actual events, where they had this insane plan, which is, if you look at the wider map of Ukraine there that you've included there in your article, you can see the Crimea outlined in black. Now, what the plan obviously was, and this has been talked about endlessly in the British press, is that, well, if we just do some big assault around Crimea, the Russians will panic, run away, and then we'll be in Crimea by tea time, which is as insane as anything that a World War I British general would have come out with. In fact, it's probably more insane. All predicated on the idea that the Russians will just run away. And this is the most deluded nonsense, because it's based on nothing, or maybe not nothing. It's based on, as we've talked about before, a misunderstanding of the Russian army in the early 90s Chechen War, which is where that kind of thing did happen for a little while, until the Russian military and state machine were sort of restabilized. So in 94, yes, they might have been right for a little while about what happened in like Grozny, but that was 30 years ago last year. This is not the Russian army of today. And the Russian army of today is not the same as it was in 2022. They're not going to just cut and run. It also completely misunderstands what happened in Crimea in 2014, which is, as Jacques Beau and others have talked about, which is Crimea joining the Russian Federation was not some plot that Putin cooked up in the Kremlin. In fact, the Russian hierarchy was very split on the idea. What you got was a Crimean domestic rebellion, whereby like a lot of what were nominally Ukrainian army units just changed sides. So again, this version of history that the British are working off, even recent history, is so lost in caricatures and outdated stereotypes, and like just huffing old imperial paint fumes whilst sitting in a basement at the MOD, that they've come up with this vision that's only cost thousands of lives. And of course, Zelensky, the man nominally in charge of this, getting an appointment to London, presumably with his several different mistresses in tow, that just looks like a payoff, basically. Good job, mate. You've done what we asked. Now, here's a mansion. Here's a large pile of cash. here's some women. Now, kindly don't write your memoirs until Keir Starmer has been chased into retirement and disgrace. Um,
Which could be in a few weeks,
could be
as
soon.
we'll get into. But
As,
I am reminded of this stuff with, yeah, that like Blackadder goes forth, which is
mm,
the fourth season of the famed Blackadder comedy series, in which is set in World War I when they're in the trenches, and there is there's a rather wonderful scene where Blackadder is speaking to Colonel Melchett, who is
mm,
many miles behind the front line. Melchett says, "Well, we've come up with this amazing, cunning new plan."
mm,
And Blackadder says, "Is it to just send wave after wave of people over the top until everyone's dead?" And Melchett says, "Jesus Christ, how could you possibly know this? How could this have leaked?"
yes.
We must have an internal investigation. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I made the point just to close out this section. I made the point in my in my piece that it probably wouldn't happen because reasons, but at least formally and officially, if a disaster like this happened with the British military, everyone responsible for planning it and commanding it and signing off on it would get court-martialed.
Mm,
I mean, that would be the official means of dealing with something like this. As it's the Ukrainians doing the fighting and overwhelming dying, they are more than happy to just throw all of this insane crap at a wall in the
mm.
hope that something sticks. I think we're getting to the point where maybe even people within Britain understand that nothing is sticking. There
Mm.
is no going back. But
Yeah, it's slowly getting through, but I wanted just to share one thing before we move on, which is Boris Johnson's Global Britain plan, which, of course, some of this insane, completely unrealistic thinking was reflected in this. And I wanted just to show this because this was a speech delivered by Boris in Chatham House, London, on 2nd of December 2016. So that's quite a while ago now, but he starts off paying a warm tribute to British forces in Afghanistan, citing their heroic role in securing democracy in Afghanistan and how this was a fitting tribute to the wonderful British presence there in the past, including the antics of a certain General Elphinstone in the 1840s. Now, of course, 5 years later, 2021, as Kit was saying, the British-backed government in Afghanistan washed away like a sandcastle upon the rising tide. And so it is the case that Boris Johnson's Global Britain plan has also been washed away like a sandcastle into the rising tide. It's all over, and I wonder if Boris will ever be called to account for his many crimes. Shall we then move on to the next item on the menu, Kit?
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just on that subject of just again, just to round out this section, I do think that the change in rhetoric over the past few years has been quite remarkable. You got to remember that, like, as recently as 2021, which does feel like it was many years ago rather than just four. There was a dedicated global Britain plan that was published by
Mm.
the British government, which had all sorts of insane ideas about recreating British bases east of Suez and expanding into the Asia Pacific and all this other stuff. And it's like, do we hear anything about this now?
Mm-mm.
No.
No. No, it's disappeared. I mean, this is a product of the fact that reality is slowly biting them, and they realize that without the US being on the front foot, there is no global Britain.
Mm.
Hasn't been since the 1950s. But shall we jump to
Yes.
our friend in Washington, a certain Mr. Donald Trump, babbling away in a meeting with notable Polish exile, a certain Mr. Miłkowski, otherwise known by his code name Netanyahu, babbling and raving away about cleaning out Gaza, etc. I wanted just to mention this in passing because these are just these comments, but I wanted to get your take on it, Kit. My own analysis of it is that this is a big, essentially, consolation prize for Netanyahu, having been compelled into a ceasefire which has destabilized his political position at home. He then gets to come over here, and Trump says, "We're going to clean out Gaza, going to send them all to Indonesia," or something like that. Whereas in reality, and this points to certain things you're going to bring up later with regard to the American left and Trump. Trump said openly what Biden's policy was covertly, which is we're going to remove the entire population of Gaza and dump them in the Sinai Desert or dump them in Jordan. This, of course, caused the comprador regimes in Cairo and Amman to shit a brick because this would fundamentally destabilize both of them if this was done and they were seen to be openly collaborating with the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. Trump's now talking about it openly, basically to secure his own base. I don't think that the US forces, if they tried to repeat what the Israelis did in Gaza, would meet any higher degree of success. They may even do worse. So to me, this looks like bullshitting to try and cover up the fact that this war was disastrous for the Israeli regime. Ultimately, this is a ground fight that they could not win. And this is a Trump essentially trying to cover trying to cover for Netanyahu domestically, i.e., trying to get Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and others back on board, whilst aggression expands into the West Bank, and of course, more land seizures are carried out in Syria, which we'll come to in just a moment. But what's your interpretation of this?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that the media picture that emerges is quite interesting in that, like, before Trump's re-election, there was talk of in the Israeli media about how if Trump won, he wanted Netanyahu to wrap up the Gaza assault pretty much immediately, and then this, did come to pass. I think that there are a number of factors at work here, which is that, I mean, Trump's administration holds the rather ignominious distinction of being the most rabidly, at least on paper, pro-Zionist in US history, which is saying something. But at the same time, I think that such is the way that Trump's approaches these things. He is trying to, as you say, spin what is in many ways a huge loss for Israel as somehow a victory, and the Israeli media is making a lot now of the fact that that we are in a position to create greater Israel. Netanyahu, who is on trial while all this has been going on for industrial scale corruption over many years in office, he has been talking a big game about how he has initiated changes in West Asia unseen since Sykes-Picot, which carved the Ottoman Empire's empire in the region into artificial states under Western rule. So I think that it's effectively a way of allowing, or at least trying to give Israel some time to rearm and regroup, while spinning what is effectively a defeat by the resistance as a win, like, of sorts. And it's like, there's been a lot of talk, and and there's also been some practical movement by the IOF to do this, of expanding into the illegally occupied Golan Heights, of pushing the Palestinians into the Sinai, which is a long-standing Israeli objective as laid out by the Yinon plan in the early 1980s, in order to create facts on the ground that Israel can exploit to justify again militarily occupying Egyptian territory. But yeah, I mean, but behind it, it's like, so you have Israel, which has suffered a huge population collapse since October 7th. Their entire economy is basically collapsed and is backed up by US fiat. There was a Moody's report which acknowledged that US aid, which we'll get into, has been underwriting all of Israel's debts, of which there are many. So it's like, well, it's given Polish undercover operative, quote unquote, Netanyahu, the political and rhetorical space to claim, well, I've achieved all of these great victories, and I am, the leader who fundamentally and decisively laid the foundation of Greater Israel, while also covering for the fact that this has been a total disaster.
Yes.
For the Zionist entity. And I might add as well that, like, again, in Lebanon, I think that there was some surprise that I detected among supporters of the resistance, that Hezbollah had been restrained in terms of its use of missiles and other armaments in its possession. And I think it's, I mean, a reflection of the fact that they didn't want to expend all of their stockpiles on this conflict, and want to maintain insurance policies and defenses for the future. But it was also because the invasion of Lebanon was a total disaster. Like, it was a total disaster in which the Israel suffered. I mean, they inflicted a lot of damage.
Yes.
But and they have sought to occupy and annex, at least informally, parts of southern Lebanon. But it didn't work out very well for them at all in the end. And then they after a few months of getting absolutely pounded, they claimed, well, all of our military objectives have been achieved, and now we want a ceasefire. As we've discussed before, there was understandably, a lot of kind of mass anti-imperialist mourning when the Assad government fell in Syria. But I do think that there was probably a calculation made by Assad's supporters and underwriters in Tehran and Moscow, that actually the loss of Syria probably created more problems for the US and Israel than it produced benefits.
Well,
and to an extent, I think we're already seeing that play out.
I think this is a good time to pivot now to
Yes.
exactly that, which is that the biggest advance the Israeli army has actually made in the last year was when nobody was actually opposing them. It was into Syria after the collapse of the Assad government. So our old friends, friends of the show, Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, have finally, Rory has managed to find true love in the form of now President Al Jilani. Look at the expression on
I think
Rory's face there.
could you just click on Rory's picture just to see just see how thrilled he is, like,
Oh,
just so. And this is in stark contrast of as we've discussed before, this veteran MI6 weirdo who was, when he was running for London mayor, like, one of the components of his campaign was to ask Londoners to have him stay over at their homes, and then he snapped these selfies with Londoners, markedly Londoners who happened to not be white. He wasn't smiling at all. Was clearly very uncomfortable being in their presence. But it's like, and I think that there's another. This is more revealing than war criminal Campbell intended. And he said, "This is why we were in Syria," and it's like, yeah, that is why the British and the Americans
finally, the
were in
truth.
Syria. Yeah, that is why the British, like, long term, they wanted a pliant extremist puppet government who would say how high when they said jump. And Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart have travelled to Syria to meet with the head of HTS, a kind of veteran ISIS butcher, and they boast about how we have a full interview out on leading Monday, whatever that means. And they are clearly so thrilled to be there, to be sat in the presidential palace in Damascus with someone who has personally killed an incalculable number of people and has now claimed on the basis of nothing to be the legitimate ruler of Syria, and also ruled out elections for many years. It's really, I think, again, this is a demonstration of enduring British imperial delusion. Keir Starmer, who again we'll get into in due course, he very boldly proclaimed that the fall of Assad would lead to a renewed role for Britain an enlarged role for Britain in West Asia. Doing what?
Podcasts.
Chummy sit down podcasts with mass murderers seems to be about the extent of British influence in the region currently.
Well, this of course leads us to a note on the activities of al-Sharaa, al-Jilani, whatever his actual name is, and whoever he might actually be. He has, and this is probably the reason why Rory was beaming so contentedly at him. He has essentially agreed to sell Syria to the highest bidder, or perhaps the lowest bidder. So maybe Alistair and Rory have got shares in some of the companies lined up for this. So what's gone on this week is that Erdogan has been down there and looking much less pleased to be there than Rory and Alistair were, and has sat down with Giuliani, and they have agreed to have essentially Turkish bases cover the north of Syria. This was talked about in, we'll pull this up now, in an article on France 24, apparently about fighting terror, though we all know what that means when Erdogan talks about it. So essentially, the Turks will be given by Giuliani the northern part of the country. God knows what that's going to mean for the US presence there, which Trump's talking about drawing down or getting rid of entirely now. We'll see if that turns out to be the case, whether he's prepared to essentially abandon the Kurdish proxies there to the fate that Erdogan has in store for them. And of course, the south of the country, Giuliani has decided, on the instructions of his true masters in Washington and London, to essentially hand over more and more territory to Israeli control. So the northern part of Syria, what was Syria, Erdogan intends clearly to swallow it. The Israeli regime, this is the only victory they're going to get. So they will swallow as much of Syria as they can get away with. Giuliani, being just a corrupt scumbag who's happy to rule over essentially the presidential palace in Damascus and not a lot else, is going to sit there trying to run this sort of cartoon caliphate in the middle of the country, whilst the north and the south get absorbed by a NATO country in Turkey and a extension of the US in the form of the Israeli colonial regime. That's your man. And it just reveals, to go to what you were saying, Kit, which is what the war on terror really was. It's a giant series of frauds. Because this guy was Al-Qaeda, this guy was ISIS, this guy was any combination of the above that you like, given whatever the most convenient label for him to wear at the time was. He's a long-term British and American operative who is following orders and is a very reliable foot soldier. So this is who the war on terror was supposedly fought against. By people like Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, who 20 years ago were running around screaming about gotta fight Al-Qaeda here, there, and everywhere. But they were never fighting Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was always their proxy force on the ground in various different places that served as a justification for various different things, depending upon what the needs of London and Washington were at any given time. So did you have anything you wanted to round up this particular segment on, Kit? Any further comments?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, just very briefly, and again, it's something that we've discussed before. And I mean, I would urge, Alex, the mighty Alex mentioned in the introduction to the show that we will be on Spotify in audio form, so you can catch up with all of our old shows. They are timeless and evergreen.
Indeed.
So if not ever more relevant, so please do give that a re-listen. But it's like we've discussed this before, where it's like I do think that in the spirit of these things, that there is zero real plan for there's never been any serious post-Assad plan. And it's like, well, finally we've got rid of him. Well, what next? Oh, we don't know. And I think that as you mentioned, already before Assad's departure, at the end of last year, that Syria was portions of the country were dominated or occupied by groups like HTS. There was that Kurdish enclave, which was also overrun by the CIA and MI6. I think that the possibility of keeping Syria whole as it exists now, like a unified unitarian state, is very doubtful. And it has created an enormous number of problems for the powers who were doing this. And it's like, right, so we got rid of this dictator that we've been trying to get rid of for over a decade. Now what? Oh, we don't know. And all of the smiling photo ops with Rory Stewart in the world doesn't change the fact that actually Yolani outside the extremist enclave that he was running, which was also overrun by British assets like the White Helmets, interestingly, who HTS left alone. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. Outside that portion of the country, HTS doesn't really have much reach. Beyond the media saying, well, they're now the Western media saying they're now the government. They're not accepted, let alone embraced, by the overwhelming majority of the population of Syria. There is a brewing refugee crisis. There are pushes by certain portions of the country to secede. This is a nest of vipers that has been created underneath the PR veneer of smiling Yolani, or indeed whatever his name is. There are very, very, very big problems. And as we've discussed, privatizing Syria's previously mixed market economy and selling it at fire sale prices to Western investors is not going to solve the problem. No. It's just going to make things worse, actually.
Yeah, you'll end up with state disintegration, basically. And
yes.
And neither Israel nor Turkey will be able to successfully swallow these bits of land without incurring significant risks, especially, for both ends of the country. Resistance will emerge to both the Turks and the Zionists, and it will be proved to be far too costly for them to hang on to. Now, talking about the end of things and talking about potential state disintegration, we come, of course, to Perfidious Albion. And I referred...
Our favourites.
Oh, yes. I referred, of course, earlier on to the oeuvre of an actor called Robin Asquith. Now, you might ask who Robin Asquith is if you're not familiar with British cultural history, particularly of the early to middle 1970s. Now, Robin Asquith was the star of a series of films called the Confessions movies, which were essentially bawdy sex comedies of the, which were hilariously parodied in the Fast Show in a sketch entitled Confessions of a Door-to-Door Cucumber Salesman. Now,
yes, I remember.
Keir Starmer has been linked with the either wife or ex-wife of these films, Robin Asquith, in a scandal that hit the Mail and other newspapers this week, which is that Keir Starmer had been receiving lessons from a woman called Leonie Mellinger, who was a personal consultant who Starmer is accused of violating lockdown laws to have sessions with. Now, Kit, you and I are both men of the world. We have known the British media and observed it for many years. When the Daily Mail, or indeed anybody, runs a story like this, where they're pointedly not saying something, What
Mm.
is the something, and why was Keir Starmer so desperate for voice coaching in the middle of lockdown when he still sounds like a strangulated cat trying to digest a particularly hot chili pepper? Her voice coaching doesn't seem to have actually worked very well, does it? So, what on earth could the Daily Mail be meaning by running this story?
Yeah, well, I mean, I always use the analogy of an asthmatic beetle to refer to how Starmer talks, but I prefer your analogy. But it's like, I mean, the British media is very big on euphemism, and so, for instance, they will refer to people who are clearly drunk or out of their minds on drugs as tired and emotional. And or there is the far more sinister references to how Robert Maxwell, the likely Mossad and MI6 asset who
Hmm.
ran the Mirror, and the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, the madam of Jeffrey Epstein,
Hmm.
had a unusually close relationship. I mean, it's why would you ever refer to a father son, sorry, a father daughter relationship as unusually close? I mean, there is a lot of very heavy implications in all of the reporting on Starmer breaching lockdown rules on Christmas Eve. Of all times,
Hmm.
when we are told by the Guardian that Keir Starmer is a dedicated family man, and he loves his wife and daughter very very much, and son, and they're very very close. So on December 24th, he decided to quite bizarrely and for no apparent reason get voice coach lessons from someone with a racy past. So I mean they're ladling it on, like pretty thick here, with the very obvious implication that this was for sexual purposes. There have been multiple rumors swirling on Twitter for many years about Starmer's sexual impropriety. And so, I mean, I do wonder whether, and this story has blown up in a way that most critical stories of Starmer have not. I mean, he is already confirmed to have breached lockdown regulations to have a beer and curry night with Labour Party apparatchiks while leader. And
Can I just
but
say,
this
just for
is
a moment, that is a party that I would never want him to be invited to. That's like the
oh
least
God.
appealing social gathering ever. Can you even imagine what the conversation around that table must have been like? Jesus.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's one of those moments where you both do and don't want to be a fly on the wall. Like, I mean, just it would be, it's voyeuristic rubbernecking of the highest order. But
Mm,
yeah, so I mean, I think that this adds to, as we have discussed before, that there is a kind of growing push against Starmer in the media. There have been
mm,
numerous attempts to I wouldn't even say rehabilitate him, because it suggests that he was ever popular or had any credibility. To habilitate him,
mm.
maybe might be a better turn of phrase. Um, and now, very oddly, we are getting this kind of more than 4-year-old scandal, which, in the spirit of these things, mainstream journalists seem to have known about well in advance and have not said anything about until now. If you look at polls, Starmer is perilously unpopular. Nigel Farage or Farage or whatever he wants to call himself is considerably more popular. There are huge, again, we'll get into, there are very dark clouds on the horizon for Britain. And I think, again, as we've discussed, Starmer, because of his obsession with keeping the proxy war going, and because of his support for Kamala Harris, he has kind of painted himself into a corner where it's very difficult to back down from. He boasted at a NATO summit weeks after getting elected, we're going to be giving Ukraine billions annually for as long as it takes, because Russia can't win this thing. And this
Mm.
was reiterated by the exact phraseology was reiterated by Rachel Reeves when she was announcing the budget,
Mm.
which includes all manner of cuts and other policies that Labour stood on a platform form of not formally opposing, but rhetorically opposing. And so I do strongly suspect that a decision has been made to get rid of him, because I think, we stated in the last Decline and Fall, the establishment wanted Tony Blair 2.0, and they haven't got that on a startling scale.
Oh, they've got basically Liz Truss, but male. That's essentially
Yes.
it.
Yes.
And I must say, like, the British security state really doesn't know how to pick him anymore, because this guy's a fucking moron. Like, I mean, I've talked about this ad nauseum, so I won't go on too long about it.
No.
But like, he reads the lines unconvincingly, whereas like at least a Tony Blair was a decent actor. But the fact that Reeves and Starmer use the exact same wording should tell you that it's not that they just use the same speechwriters, it's that that's the brief handed to them by the security state apparatchiks, who said, Keir, this is the line on Ukraine, and you better get on with it. Otherwise, we might have to show that photo of you in flagranti whilst getting voice coaching lessons on Christmas Eve, Keir. Get on with it, mate. So what happens when, again, like, this is old yes minister stuff. The permanent officialdom hand these bozos a series of scripts, and their job is to read it out. And you would be profoundly mistaken if you thought that any of them, whether it is Reeves or Starmer or Badnock or Farage, to be completely honest, would be any different, because all of them are literally brought on board, told what to do, and anybody who steps out of line is rapidly sidelined or worse. So this is Britain now, which is facing an increasing problem with regard to overcommitting to this Ukraine disaster, and with reserve currency status being threatened, increasing questions being raised over British debt. What they will do, I think, is they won't want the British ruling class won't want an election immediately. What they will do is they will shuffle Starmer out. My guess is they'll let him have a year. So like June or July next year, he'll probably be gone by then under a cloud. And then it will be this odious homunculus called Wes Streeting, who will probably take over, who's even worse, but is slightly slimier and a slightly more convincing performer. And the Labour Party's job for the next 4 years will essentially be to prepare the ground for a much more aggressive, much more dangerous merger or coalition between the Tories and Reform, which will come in and then really look to stick the boot in at the end of the decade, barring, of course, other disasters that could emerge in the near future and are indeed likely to emerge. Now, Starmer biting the bullets and getting told to fuck off is quite funny. But of course, this is not nearly as dramatic as that which is going on the other side of the Atlantic, because we've now got a US Secretary of State essentially admitting what yourself and others, outlets like the Grey Zone Kit, have reported for many years, which is that this the moment that existed after 1991, the unipolar moment, is over. It's all over, and now there needs to be a reshaping of the American state machine in order to cope with this new reality. So this is the words of Marco Rubio, of course, in his interview with Megyn Kelly. This is published, a transcript of which is published on the US State Department's website, which we are, of course, showing now. So, Kit, what did you make of all of this, and how should we see this in terms of the priorities across the other side of the Atlantic?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it's very interesting that I mean, we've just gone from Starmer determinedly continuing to bang the imperialist drum when it is so clearly over that even Marco Rubio, who is not known for being particularly dovish on anything, and has this whole fake backstory about how his family fled communist repression under Castro from Cuba when actually they left under Batista, and has, called for strikes on Iran, called for war with China, was wearing Juan Guaido hoodies when the Trump administration was trying to overthrow Venezuela. In this interview with Megyn Kelly of Fox News infamy, he made some an astonishing comments where he basically said that the post-war US dominated world is obsolete, and not only that, but also that period, that kind of the post-Cold War period, where the US was the only power in the world, and was, yes, effectively the global government to a large extent, is over. And it's never coming back. And he explicitly stated it's not normal to have a unipolar world. This was a historical anomaly, and we are going back to a multipolar, multi-power world. Now, it is shocking to hear Rubio talk like John Mearsheimer, or like another geopolitical analyst of some credibility. But I think that this is effectively and you've got to bear in mind as well that the US is now already waging trade wars against alleged allies like Mexico and Canada, and even the EU with all sorts of tariffs. Is that I think this is the US effectively saying, well, we had a shot at running the world. It didn't really work out in the end. It was never going to be permanent. And so we're basically just stepping back from this on our own terms. And I think this feeds into a lot of what the Trump administration is doing more widely, both at home and abroad, is that it is, as we've discussed before, it is repurposing its empire, it's restructuring its empire. It is acknowledging that, well, yes, we had a good run of it with overthrowing all of these governments via color revolution and civil society infiltration all over the world. But in terms of the grand chessboard, if a country like, say, Slovakia or Bosnia, population 3 million, is within the US camp or not, isn't really any of our business. It's not really a kind of core concern of ours, because ultimately the US retains an enormous amount of internal wealth. It has its own quote unquote backyard in Latin America to run roughshod over, and it is in a position of complete and total political, economic, and military dominance over Western Europe. So it's like, well, we're withdrawing while maintaining this power. Now, I think this feeds neatly into what we were going to discuss about US aid. But if you look, these are the figures that Alex now has on the screen. These are funding totals for what was spent between 2020 and 2025 on aid, quote unquote, programs in the West Balkan Six, which is to say the former Yugoslavia and Albania. Now, if you hover over the total for 2020 to 2024, Alex, in the bottom right corner, right, so between 2020 and 2025, the US spent 1.7 billion on the West Balkans. Now, as we discussed, living in the Balkans myself, I am, on a daily basis, confronted with the extent of societal penetration of US aid. I had to go to see a doctor the other day. They had US aid logos within their offices. But the societal benefit from this, zero. There are still the West Balkan Six, mass unemployment, mass poverty, low wages, huge, very significant societal issues that are are very difficult to resolve. All of this aid has done nothing apart from enrich US contractors and enrich the microscopic elites within these countries who work for the NGOs and independent media outlets and activist groups that the US is funding. Outside of that, no one's really benefiting from it. And I do think that there is a cognizance that this is basically a waste of money with a significant capacity for blowback. So the US empire is now voluntarily withdrawing from spheres of influence where it was pointless to have a sphere of influence in the first place. And I noticed there has been a lot of concern raised in some quarters about the prospect of US aid and NED regime change and clandestine operations being made overt again and being repurposed by the CIA. I find it very difficult to believe that the CIA has any interest in running free condom distribution operations. I find it very difficult to believe that they are interested in sponsoring LGBTQ parades in Serbia. I think a lot of this a lot of this stuff won't be repurposed. I think that there's also the prospect that the soft power reduction could be met with an attempted hard power offset, or this money could be pumped into the $500 billion Stargate project, which already seems dead in the water due to the launch of DeepSeek. But they do seem very serious about clearing out US aid. Like, it is shut down. It doesn't have a website. A senior US aid official, as Alex has on the screen now, tried to undo the purge of US aid staffers and then was himself fired. So, I mean, they seem to be playing for keeps with this. Now, there is an amazing clip from an ABC News report that I've included in the show notes where ABC interviewed a USAID staffer who was in the building when Doge or Dodge or Dog or whatever they're called, the Department of Government Efficiency or Inefficiency, that burst into their headquarters. There's this woman who testifies how, and she's wearing a rather colourful hoodie. She states that when the second that Doge burst into the building, we were very hurriedly tearing down our pride flags, getting rid of anything that we felt would be quote unquote incriminating. I wonder what that could be.
Well, let's have a quick look at this clip, shall we, Kit?
Yes.
That you've sent over here. So let me just call up the share option now. Okay, so we should be able to see that now. Let's have a look at this. This is from ABC. So there you go. Now, it's rather entertaining to the idea that Elon and his team of unpaid interns turned up and basically undid a US intelligence network. But I think it points to a much more serious realignment, which, as you are saying, Kit, which is that they are now looking at some of them in the administration will want to replace this with hard power, with overt coups, etc., which I don't really think they have the means to do as much anymore. Certainly not in places like the Balkans and the east of Europe. I think they are probably going to try and say they're going to leave that to the Germans, who won't be able to do it either. And then you might actually see some progress in that part of the world. But also they're shutting down elements of the state machine, the imperial machine, that were associated with the failed policies of what is referred to as the Uni Party of the last 30 years. So the cross party alliance between Democrats and Republicans in pursuit of the aims of US imperialism. But as you were saying, in many areas of the world, this hasn't delivered what the US was wanting. So, for instance, in Afghanistan, there's a whole shit ton of rare earth metals in Afghanistan, which the Chinese are now getting access to in terms of actually setting up mining operations and being able to extract them. The US didn't manage to do that for 20 years when they had nominal control over the country and all this US aid and NED money flying in. They couldn't get anything out. Same's true in a lot of other countries as well. They can still extract stuff from the imperial core nations and from South America, from the Caribbean. But in terms of a lot of these operations, these were just what I'm going to call like superstructure only stuff, civil society stuff, but with zero actual economic muscle to back it up with. So what they ended up doing was trying to bring the sort of local oligarchs on side to try and work with them. That didn't work. So they ended up with like essentially something which I'm going to say is all icing and no cake, which is all civil society, very little economic actual benefit. And now the Trump group and the bit of the ruling class they're associated with has stepped in and decided to focus on where they can better extract value from. And it ain't the Balkans and it ain't probably most of Eastern Europe and quite a lot of probably Central Asia as well. So the realignment is real. What it will lead to, we don't know, but it certainly is the case that the tactics of the last 30 years have come to a close, and those associated with them are being purged because of what amounts to a gigantic, costly, and embarrassing failure.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just like again, we've discussed before, but it's like the empire is after easy, easy returns, and for a country like the US, which is, there's that great quote, which is "War was invented to teach Americans geography." For a vast country which is separated from most of the world by vast oceans, surrounded by militarily ineffectual non-threats such as Mexico and Canada, and does have some remaining clout within its immediate sphere of influence. It's too much of a hassle to wrap your head as a US planner to wrap your head around the cultural, ethnic, and other issues in a country like Afghanistan. And so it's like, that was a bonanza for contractors, and there was an enormous amount of corruption and embezzlement that went on there. But in terms of actually accessing the resources that they really wanted, they failed, like they failed in the Balkans. And so, I do think there is an element here of just it's throwing in the towel, but it's like it while singing a rousing rendition of "My Way" by by Frank Sinatra. It's like, well, yeah, we came, we saw, we made a ton of money, and now we're buggering off. That seems to be the order of the day, and it's like it's also just more generally it is a wider manifestation, I think, of how the US aid cut has left a large number of people unable to respond effectively to what the Trump administration is doing. There is some whining about how, oh well, HIV vaccination programs in Africa are now at risk. That's like 1% of what they do.
Yeah.
And I might add as well, for the people who are worried, understandably, about USAID programs being taken back in house by the CIA and carried out covertly. This didn't happen by happenstance. It happened because people like you and I, and a great many other dissident academics and activists and journalists, never stopped exposing the reality of what these agencies were doing.
Hmm. Yeah.
Like were it not for significant pushback from independent dissident voices, they would still be carrying on with this. So this is still a victory, no matter the threat, no matter the risks and potential hazards.
Well, I would also add that the NED and USAID's playbook was essentially laid bare and exposed by the Chinese Foreign Ministry in official guidance that they sent out in August of last year, basically going through play by play what these organizations do, how they move their money around, how they seek to mobilize so-called activists on the ground. Of course, the Chinese intelligence services had a good look at these people in Hong Kong and essentially brought all the lessons out, put them all in a document, stuck it online, so anybody who was anybody in the world could read this. And that essentially, combined with what the Russians have done to shut down operations in Russia and how the Belarusians have essentially squashed the NED and USAID run operation in their country. That's it. I mean, there's no the gig is the gig is blown now. The Georgians, the Georgian Dream Party, formerly this pro-EU, relatively pro-US party, suddenly worked out that what they were next on the chopping block, decided to change course, and then the USAID, NED, CIA, and etc. tried everything they possibly could, but it didn't work because it's been 25 years now, no, 30 years of this. Everybody knows the tactics. Everybody knows the limitations of the tactics. It's not, it's not Yugoslavia in the year 2000 anymore. Everybody knows that if you keep your coalition intact, if you keep your state forces disciplined, if you deny these people the oxygen of publicity that they're after and deny them escalation, then you can hold through these things. And also, perhaps this is a good note to end on because we're coming up to the 2 hour mark now. Unless you want to dive into Ukraine a little bit, Kit. What do you reckon?
Well, I mean, I mean, there were some points I wanted to make, but carry on.
Okay. Well, we'll do some more on this then. Everybody's worked it out. This is an operation which no longer holds any surprises for anybody anymore. Its failures are massive and egregious. When someone like Musk says it's totally corrupt, yeah, he's right. Yes, Musk has in mind replacing it with his own version of corruption, but the leakage of money out of these operations is astounding. It's made a lot of people an awful lot of money, again, reflected in houses in the Washington suburbs. So this particular phase of the empire has been brought to an end. What emerges next, we will have to see. But this particularly annoying, dangerous, hypocritical, and pride flag draped period is over. What did you want to add, Kit?
Well, yeah, precisely. I think this ties it up very neatly, which is that I think that as we discussed when we carried out our post-mortem of Joe Biden's god-awful, world-threatening presidency, is that there was, at least for the first 2 years of Biden being in office, an attempt to reframe the US empire as intersectional. And we had the woke CIA recruitment ads. We had the Biden snapping selfies with female members of the military and Kamala Harris and saying this is what a vice president looks like. This is what a US soldier looks like. And really, really, really pushing this stuff. And then we fast forward to today, and the New York Times. And as I said, the lack of pushback against a lot of what the Trump administration is doing amongst every gradient of the left, from the mainstream kind of centrist compatibles to many people on the kind of ostensibly anti-imperialist left. They don't really know what to make of Trump or how to respond to him, because he's waging war on the FBI, the CIA, NED, US aid, and other enemies of progress overseas, which these same sources have opposed for many years. But because of Trump derangement syndrome and Orange Man bad, they're stuck in a bind because it's like, well, I mean, you can't say anything that can be mildly construed as endorsing what Trump's doing, yet he is doing what he is fulfilling your wildest wet dreams in terms of downsizing the US empire overseas. And it's like, yes, that there is this New York Times piece based on more than 50 interviews with Democratic leaders. Quite who they are, I'm not sure at this point. I mean, the Democrats have seemingly vanished from all public consideration following Kamala Harris' rather embarrassing drubbing. The headline was, "We have no coherent message," and it stated that Democrats struggle to oppose Trump. And it's like, well, yeah, of course they're struggling to oppose Trump because they tried for 4 years, but it was more likely just two, to offer difference in the form of DEI. Like, we're different to the Republicans and we're different to Trump because we care about pronouns. And they have fundamentally and quite catastrophically lost the argument on this. Like, they've been bitterly defeated, and it's like, well, what do we offer now? Oh, well, we haven't got anything to offer because we are identical. We are absolutely identical, except we say things more nicely and in a more kind of civilized, polite manner. And I think that this will continue. They don't have the Russiagate bullshit to fall back on this time. They have no real recourse to the fact that what Trump is doing is very popular, and in many cases, if these people were honest, they would support it themselves if they thought that there wouldn't be personal and professional consequences for them, which is certainly not to endorse the Trump administration, which does seem to have in many ways extremely malign designs, particularly re Gaza and Israel. But the fact of the matter is that once you strip away these layer upon layer of rhetorical bullshit about there is no fundamental difference. There is no radical alternative being proposed by anyone. And more widely, we are in the Western world a state of very severe trouble, but nobody is offering anything or any serious alternative, let alone anything new.
Yes. Well, I mean, what typifies the actual reality of the Democratic Party is the fact that their policy on Gaza was to ethnically cleanse it and pretend they were looking for a peace deal. Trump's policy is to talk about ethnically cleansing it openly, whilst, again, basically adopting the same peace formula that Biden had been pissing around with for over a year. And so this is the difference. It comes down to how open are you prepared to be about the thuggishness and violence of the empire. Trump is going to be out there being open about it. The Democrats think that they can just nuance this to death. Turns out that they can't. And also, the section of the American ruling class that is in the ascendancy now have clearly decided that there needs to be some kind of change and that they had better steer it. I don't think that this will solve any of their problems, but what it is an attempt to right the ship, which has been listing badly for many, many years, and which the Democrats and their particular brand of politics have sought to essentially slap this DEI re-emergence of the great American dream with pride flag colors on it as their unifying narrative for the country and the imperial project over the last decade. And it just has not worked at all. It has not helped them revive loyalty to the state domestically, nor has it really gained them much in terms of restoring the ability of the US empire to project its power. In fact, if anything, it's got worse. So what's happening, what you're seeing now, whether it's the CIA, the FBI, USAID, NED, is essentially people who were associated with a failed project being purged. And the reason why the left doesn't know in the United States doesn't know how to respond to it is because most of the left in the United States, with some honorable exceptions, are pro-imperialist and have been for a very long time. And so when it comes down to it, they might rhetorically oppose a war. They might rhetorically oppose the what they would say is the overreaches of the FBI, the CIA, or the numerous other intelligence agencies. But when it came down to it, they were more than prepared to side with these agencies in a horrific, non-popular front against the Orange bad man, and revealed themselves for exactly what they were, which is stooges of the U.S. imperialism. So these people have no message. They don't have anything to say to the great majority of the US working class, and they don't deserve to be listened to either. So good night and good riddance, and may something emerge soon which can actually do the job of seriously opposing the US ruling class, no matter which mask it's wearing at the time. I believe that leads us to roughly the concluding part of today's episode. Kit, did you have any final thoughts before we take our leave of the good people this week?
No, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, and it's like, and I think it's very you struck upon something very interesting, which is that like the first Trump campaign showed from literally even from before day one the willingness of people who claim to be possessed of radical politics or progressive views to seek solace and security and protection from the very sources that oppress and persecute them, like the FBI. My friend and Grey Zone colleague Aaron Mate has a great line, which is that Russiagate was a privilege protection racket. You had people in the streets protesting with banners saying, "Please save us, Mueller."
Yeah.
Like Robert Mueller, who was like at the forefront of the war on terror and carrying out stings that got mentally ill, disadvantaged people jailed for life in bogus terrorism stings. There was people the people who considered themselves on the left were looking to the very forces arrayed against them to save them.
Mm.
And then
Yes.
now their bête noire, enemy in chief, Trump is waging war against those forces, and they have nothing to say. I think that this, I mean, as again we have discussed directly and indirectly so many times, the need for the creation of new structures totally outside any mainstream cadres or similar has never been more palpable than it is today, because there is a huge amount of dissent, disagreement, disillusionment with established political parties, with established institutions, with established parties. And the prospect of change is there if you believe in it and actually do something about it. And we spoke about Starmer and the likelihood that he's going to be couped. It
Mm.
is somewhat forgotten that in many cases, including Wes Streeting, his likely successor, who may or may not allegedly enjoy cocaine, according to some, again, media innuendo and rumor, he was a few hundred votes off losing his seat. There were a large number of candidates who stood independently on pro-Palestinian platforms, who came within a gnat's wing of winning or outright won without any money, without any
Mm.
media support, without any institutional backing whatsoever in the most recent UK general election. There are millions of people who want a new general election. Let's get our act together, people.
Mm. Yes, indeed, because if we don't, then the British ruling class will offer a fake alternative in the form of a coalition between Reform and the Conservative Party, which will make Keir Starmer's mob look mild by comparison in terms of what they do. But make no mistake, Keir Starmer's Labour Party, indeed Labour Party in general, is there to soften us up, to demobilise and disempower us, ready for the return of a much more aggressive reactionary force in the form of Reform and the Tories, who will come in as the next part of the left-right punch. It is imperative that we find a way to block and divert the punches of the ruling class and turn their force against them. Kit, our man in the once and future Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, thank you for joining me again this week for the latest episode of Decline and Fall.
God bless you. Take care, guys. Thanks for joining us.
And we'll see you again next week.
See you again next week. Take care.
Mother man, he left the people on the road to all devil and he planted and there comes your name die. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin's into the north, and there's the rivers three, all empty.